Chapter 1. Invitation to Blackwood Manor. The early October rain pattered against the windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, creating a soothing rhythm that accompanied the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in her sitting room. The afternoon light had grown dim, forcing her to adjust her reading spectacles as she examined the letter that had arrived with the morning post. The cream-colored stationery bore the elegant handwriting of Eleanor Vane, a school friend from her youth, whom she had not seen in nearly 5 years. Miss Marple's thin fingers traced the embossed letterhead, Blackwood Manor, Hampshire, as she read the curious contents once more. "My dearest Jane," the letter began, "I find myself in the most peculiar circumstances and am in desperate need of your particular talents for observation and discernment. Strange occurrences have plagued Blackwood Manor since the installation of Lady Blackwood's portrait in the main hall 3 weeks prior. Objects disappear only to reappear in the most unusual places. Footsteps echo through empty corridors in the dead of night, and the servants speak in hushed tones of a presence that seems to have awakened within these ancient walls." Miss Marple poured herself another cup of Darjeeling, considering the invitation. Eleanor had been appointed as companion to Caroline Blackwood some years ago, and while they had maintained correspondence, her friend had never before expressed such disquiet. "I implore you, Jane," the letter continued, "to join us for a fortnight. Sir Richard insists these events are mere coincidence, or the product of overactive imaginations, but I sense something far more sinister at work. The portrait itself, a recently discovered work of the late Lady Blackwood, painted shortly before her untimely death, a decade ago, seems to cast a pall over all who gaze upon it." By the following Tuesday, Miss Marple found herself seated in a first-class carriage of the 2:15 train to Hampshire, her knitting needles clicking softly as the countryside rolled past the window. The rain had given way to a heavy mist that clung to the hills and obscured the distant tree line, lending an ethereal quality to the landscape. As the train pulled into the small rural station, she observed a tall, austere man in formal driving attire standing beside a gleaming Rolls-Royce. He approached as she descended from the carriage. "Miss Marple, I presume?" The chauffeur's voice was clipped and precise. "I am Hawkins, Sir Richard's driver. I have been instructed to convey you to Blackwood Manor." The drive was a silent affair, winding through narrow country lanes bordered by ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches intertwined overhead like arthritic fingers. The mist had thickened, and by the time the imposing silhouette of Blackwood Manor emerged from the gloom, the afternoon had surrendered entirely to the encroaching evening. The manor was a formidable structure of grey stone and Gothic embellishments, its windows like watchful eyes peering out across the manicured gardens, now shrouded in mist. As the motor car crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, the great oak door swung open, spilling warm light onto the steps. "Jane! Oh, my dear Jane!" Eleanor Vane hurried down the steps, her usual composure momentarily forgotten, as she embraced her old friend. Though still handsome, Eleanor's face bore new lines of worry, and her eyes darted nervously toward the house, even as she smiled. "How grateful I am that you've come." "It is lovely to see you again, Eleanor," Miss Marple replied warmly, studying her friend's countenance with careful attention. "Though I do wish the circumstances were more pleasant." "Indeed," Eleanor whispered, taking Miss Marple's arm as they ascended the steps. "But we shall not speak of such matters out here. Sir Richard and the others are gathered in the drawing-room before dinner. I shall introduce you." The interior of Blackwood Manor was as impressive as its facade. Polished oak paneling lined the entrance hall, and a magnificent staircase curved upward toward the darkened upper floors. Gas lamps and electric lights existed in curious juxtaposition throughout, suggesting the reluctant modernization common to ancient homes in this new era. But it was the portrait that immediately drew Miss Marple's gaze, a life-sized painting of a regal woman in her middle years, positioned prominently at the foot of the staircase. Lady Blackwood had been a striking woman, with penetrating eyes and a mouth that seemed caught between a smile and something far less welcoming. The artist had captured an unsettling intensity in her gaze that seemed to follow one about the room. "Quite remarkable, is it not?" came a cultured voice from behind them. "One might almost believe she watches us still." Miss Marple turned to find a young man regarding her with interest. He was perhaps 30, with artistic features and an air of studied nonchalance. "Percy Fleming," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "I had the privilege of discovering and restoring the portrait. And you must be Miss Marple, Mrs. Vane's distinguished friend from St. Giles, Mary Mead." "You are most kind, Mr. Fleming," Miss Marple replied, noting how the young man's eyes continually returned to the portrait with something akin to possessive pride. "The restoration appears most skillful. One would hardly know the painting had suffered any neglect." "You have an eye for detail, Miss Marple," Fleming remarked, seeming pleased. "The portrait was in deplorable condition when I discovered it in a forgotten attic room. It has taken me months to restore it to its former glory." "Jane, do come through," Eleanor interjected, guiding her toward the drawing-room. "Everyone is most eager to meet you." The drawing-room of Blackwood Manor reflected the competing sensibilities of its occupants, traditional furnishings arranged with modern touches, creating an elegant if somewhat discordant atmosphere. 4 figures rose as they entered. "Sir Richard Blackwood," Eleanor announced, gesturing toward a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 50 years, with silver threading through his dark hair and a stern set to his features, "our host and master of Blackwood Manor." "Miss Marple," Sir Richard acknowledged with a curt nod. "My sister's companion speaks most highly of your perspicacity, though I maintain these mysterious occurrences are nothing more than servants' gossip and imagination." "And this is Lady Blackwood," Eleanor continued, indicating a striking young woman no more than 30, whose fashionable attire and carefully arranged golden curls suggested a preoccupation with appearance. "Victoria, please," the young woman corrected with a tinkling laugh that did not reach her eyes. "We needn't stand on such formality." "How delightful to have a new face at our dinner table, Miss Marple. One does tire of the same company evening after evening." The slight narrowing of Sir Richard's eyes did not escape Miss Marple's notice. "Dr. Edward Harley," Eleanor proceeded, "family physician and longtime friend of the Blackwoods." The doctor was a portly, genial man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard. "Charmed, Miss Marple. I understand you've quite a reputation for solving little puzzles. Perhaps you might illuminate these peculiar happenings that have so agitated the household." And finally, Miss Caroline Blackwood, Sir Richard's sister. Caroline Blackwood was a tall, angular woman of around 45, with intelligent eyes and a reserved demeanor. "Miss Marple," she acknowledged with a genuine smile. "I hope your journey was not too taxing. Hampshire can be quite forbidding in the autumn mists. Harold Winters, our family solicitor, is also staying with us," Sir Richard added, glancing at his pocket watch. "Though he appears to be delayed, no matter, dinner shall be served shortly." As if summoned by his words, the butler appeared at the doorway. "Dinner is served, Sir Richard." The dining-room was magnificent, with a long mahogany table set with gleaming silver and crystal that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. Miss Marple observed the seating arrangement with interest, Sir Richard at the head, with Victoria and Dr. Harley flanking him, Caroline and Eleanor situated further down, and Percy Fleming opposite Miss Marple, with an empty chair beside him, presumably for the absent solicitor. The conversation flowed in the careful, measured manner of polite society. Discussions of the weather, local affairs, and politics dominated, with occasional references to mutual acquaintance, the cool formality between Sir Richard and his sister, the lingering glances exchanged between Victoria and young Fleming when they thought no one was looking, the studied casualness with which Dr. Harley inquired about the portrait's restoration. The main course had just been cleared when the dining-room door opened to admit a thin, serious man with a meticulously groomed mustache and receding hairline. "My sincere apologies for the delay," he announced, taking his seat beside Fleming. Estate matters required my attention longer than anticipated. Harold Winters, our solicitor, Sir Richard explained tersely. This is Miss Marple, Mrs. Vane's friend from St. Mary Mead. Winters acknowledged the introduction with a polite nod, though his expression remained preoccupied as he unfolded his napkin. The dessert course had just been served when a piercing scream shattered the carefully maintained decorum of the evening. All eyes turned to Victoria, who had half risen from her chair, her face drained of colour as she stared fixedly at something beyond the dining-room door. "The portrait!" she gasped, one trembling hand pressed against her throat. "I saw it. The eyes, they moved. They followed me as I passed." Sir Richard's expression darkened as he rose abruptly. "Nonsense, Victoria." "Control yourself. I am not imagining things, Richard," Victoria insisted, her voice rising. "Ask Fleming if such a thing is possible. Perhaps some trick of the restoration process." The young artist shook his head. "The painting employs no unusual techniques, Lady Blackwood, though in certain light the eyes can appear quite lifelike. Perhaps Lady Blackwood would benefit from some air," Dr. Harley suggested, already moving toward Victoria. "These old houses can become quite stifling, and the imagination often plays tricks in dimly lit corridors." Miss Marple observed the varied reactions around the table, the flash of concern in Fleming's eyes, the calculating gaze of Harold Winters, the exchanged glance between Caroline and Eleanor, and most notably, the barely concealed anger that tightened Sir Richard's features as he watched his wife being escorted from the room. "Perhaps," Miss Marple remarked quietly to no one in particular, "there is more life in Lady Blackwood's portrait than any of us might wish to acknowledge." A heavy silence fell over the dining room, broken only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the muffled sound of Victoria's continued protestations as Dr. Harley led her away. Through the open door, Miss Marple could see the portrait of Lady Blackwood, the painted eyes seeming to meet her own with an expression of grim satisfaction. The first evening at Blackwood Manor had only just begun, and already the carefully maintained facade of propriety was beginning to crack, revealing the shadows that lurked beneath. Chapter 2. The Secret Message. The following morning dawned grey and cheerless, with a persistent drizzle that beaded on the leaded windows of Blackwood Manor. Miss Marple rose early, her habits unchanged despite the grandeur of her surroundings. She stood by the window of her elegantly appointed guest chamber, observing the mist-shrouded gardens below with their geometrical hedgerows and stone fountains, now silent in the autumn chill. A soft knock at the door announced Eleanor, who entered bearing a tray of tea. "I thought you might prefer a quiet cup before joining the others for breakfast," she said, setting the tray on a small rosewood table. "I must confess, Jane, last night's incident has rather unnerved everyone. Victoria has taken to her bed with a supposed migraine, and Sir Richard is in a foul temper." Miss Marple accepted the cup with a gentle smile. "Nerves are quite understandable when one believes oneself observed by painted eyes. My dear, tell me, when exactly was this portrait discovered?" "Percy Fleming brought it to Sir Richard's attention some 3 months ago," Eleanor replied, taking a seat opposite her friend. "He claimed to have found it in the East Wing attic while cataloguing some artworks for insurance purposes. Sir Richard commissioned him to restore it immediately. It was in dreadful condition, apparently, and insisted it be hung in the main hall upon completion." "Most interesting," mused Miss Marple, stirring her tea thoughtfully, "and the strange occurrences began only after its installation." "Almost immediately," Eleanor confirmed, lowering her voice though they were quite alone. Small items misplaced, Caroline's favorite brooch vanished from her dressing table, only to reappear in the library 2 days later. Footsteps in the corridor when no one was there. The distinct scent of Lady Blackwood's preferred perfume, lilacs and bergamot, lingering in rooms she used to frequent. "And what of Lady Blackwood herself? I understand she passed away some 10 years ago." A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. "Yes, quite suddenly. A heart condition according to Dr. Harley, though. She hesitated, though some harbored doubts. Miss Marple suggested gently. It was all most peculiar, Eleanor admitted. Lady Blackwood had always enjoyed robust health. The illness came upon her so swiftly, a matter of days from first complaint to her final breath. Caroline was devastated. She and her mother were exceedingly close, unlike Sir Richard and his mother, perhaps. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "You are as perceptive as ever, Jane." There was tension. Lady Blackwood did not approve of Victoria, whom Richard had begun courting several months before his mother's passing. The age difference was considerable, and Victoria's family, while respectable, lacked the lineage and fortune the Blackwoods had come to expect in their marital alliances. Miss Marple nodded, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. "I should like to explore the house a little this morning, if that would not be considered presumptuous." "Not at all," Eleanor assured her. "Most of the family will be occupied with their own pursuits until luncheon. Caroline spends her mornings in the conservatory with her orchids. Sir Richard attends to estate business in his study, and Dr. Harley has gone to the village to attend to a patient. Winters mentioned something about reviewing documents in the library. As for Mr. Fleming, he has taken over the old nursery as a temporary studio where he works on minor restorations." After a light breakfast taken in her room, Miss Marple embarked upon her exploration of Blackwood Manor. The house was a warren of corridors and interconnected rooms, some modernized with electric lighting and contemporary furnishings, others preserved in their original state from centuries past. The ancient timbers creaked underfoot as she made her way along the upper gallery, pausing occasionally to examine a portrait or decorative object with polite interest. The library proved to be a magnificent chamber, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather-bound volumes dating back several centuries. A massive oak desk dominated one corner, where Harold Winters sat surrounded by stacks of papers and legal tomes. "Ah, Miss Marple," he acknowledged, glancing up briefly from his work. "Exploring our little Gothic monstrosity, are you? A fascinating structure. Parts of it date back to the early 16th century. Though the main building is predominantly Jacobean, with Victorian additions." "You seem most knowledgeable about the house, Mr. Winters," Miss Marple observed, running a gloved finger along the spine of a particularly fine edition of Shakespeare's collected works. "The Blackwood estate has been under the care of my firm for 6 generations," he replied with a hint of pride. "I knew this house in Lady Blackwood's day, when it was a centre of cultural gatherings and intellectual discourse. Sir Richard's mother had quite the artistic salon, musicians, painters, writers, all frequent guests at her table." "Including young Mr. Fleming?" Miss Marple inquired innocently. A curious expression flickered across the solicitor's features, something between surprise and wariness. "Fleming?" "No. He emerged on the scene only recently, though he claims some connection to one of Lady Blackwood's artistic acquaintances, a teacher or mentor of some sort. Now, if you'll excuse me, these papers require my full attention." The dismissal was polite but firm. Miss Marple continued her wanderings, eventually finding herself in a small study adjacent to the main library. Unlike the other rooms, this one appeared neglected, with dust covers still draped over several pieces of furniture. A delicate writing desk positioned near the window caught her attention. The lock on its central drawer had been recently forced, evidenced by fresh scratches around the keyhole. Glancing over her shoulder to ensure her privacy, Miss Marple carefully opened the drawer. Inside was a leather-bound volume, a diary, its pages filled with elegant feminine handwriting. The inscription on the flyleaf read simply, "Evelyn Black." Entry was dated just 3 days before Lady Blackwood's death. Miss Marple was midway through a particularly intriguing passage, something about a secret that must be concealed behind. My eyes, when hurried footsteps in the corridor prompted her to replace the diary and close the drawer. She had just enough time to move away from the desk before Caroline Blackwood appeared in the doorway. "Miss Marple," she said, visibly startled. "I did not expect to find anyone here. This was my mother's private study. The servants are instructed to keep it closed. My apologies, Miss Blackwood, Miss Marple replied, all innocent confusion. The door was ajar, and I'm afraid curiosity got the better of me. Such a charming room. It has your mother's touch about it. Caroline's stern expression softened slightly. Yes, this was her sanctuary. She would spend hours here, writing correspondence or in quiet contemplation. Her gaze drifted to the desk, lingering momentarily on the drawer Miss Marple had hastily closed. Did you find anything of interest? Merely the expected accumulation of a well-established household, Miss Marple replied vaguely. One can learn so much about a family from their choice of literature and art. Your mother had quite refined tastes, I perceive. She was an extraordinary woman, Caroline said quietly, cultured, intelligent, and possessed of remarkable intuition about people. A quality you share, I think, Miss Marple. The luncheon gong sounded before Miss Marple could respond to this observation. The meal was a subdued affair, with Victoria still absent, and Sir Richard maintaining a frigid silence throughout. Percy Fleming attempted to lighten the atmosphere with anecdotes about his artistic adventures abroad, but his efforts met with little success. Harley, returning from his village call, seemed preoccupied, his usual genial manner replaced by a distracted air. Miss Marple noticed him studying the portrait in the hall with unusual intensity as they all departed the dining room. The afternoon brought a temporary cessation of the rain, prompting Miss Marple to suggest a turn about the gardens with Eleanor. As they strolled between the sodden boxwood hedges, Miss Marple casually inquired about the circumstances surrounding the discovery of Lady Blackwood's portrait. It does seem rather fortunate that Mr. Fleming should discover such a significant family artwork that had somehow escaped notice for a decade, she remarked. Indeed, Eleanor agreed. Though the East Wing attics are vast and had been largely neglected since Lady Blackwood's passing, Sir Richard showed little interest in his mother's artistic acquisitions. It was only when Fleming was commissioned to catalogue the collection for insurance purposes that many items came to light. And the portrait itself, did you ever see it before its restoration? Briefly, Eleanor replied. It was in dreadful condition, water-damaged and obscured by decades of grime. Fleming worked on it in London for several months. When he returned with the restored painting, everyone was astonished by the transformation. The likeness is uncanny. It captures Evelyn exactly as she was in the year before her death. As they rounded a corner of the formal garden, they encountered Victoria, wrapped in a fur-trimmed coat, despite the mild temperature, deep in conversation with Percy Fleming. The pair started guiltily at the interruption, stepping apart with suspicious haste. Mrs. Vane, Miss Marple, Victoria acknowledged coolly. Mr. Fleming was just advising me on the acquisition of a small constable's study for Richard's birthday. We were discussing the authentication process. Indeed, Fleming added smoothly, Lady Blackwood has a discerning eye for quality. The piece we're considering is quite remarkable for its provenance. Miss Marple noted the slight flush on Victoria's cheeks that owed nothing to the chill air and the way Fleming's gaze lingered on the young woman's face a moment too long. The remainder of the day passed uneventfully, with Miss Marple pleading fatigue and retiring to her room early. In truth, she wished to examine Lady Blackwood's diary more thoroughly, having secreted it within her knitting bag during her brief solitary moment in the study. The manor settled into silence as the night deepened. Miss Marple sat by the fire in her room, the diary open on her lap, her reading spectacles perched upon her nose as she carefully deciphered Lady Blackwood's elegant script. Most entries were mundane accounts of household matters and social engagements, but scattered throughout were cryptic references to a contingency that must be arranged and a truth that would devastate R, should it come to light. The final entries grew increasingly paranoid in tone, with Lady Blackwood expressing concern that she was being observed and that her personal items had been searched. The last complete entry, dated 3 days before her death, contained the most revealing passage. I have concealed the letter behind my eyes where only C would think to look. Should misfortune befall me, the truth will still find its way to light. A sudden sound, the soft creak of floorboards in the corridor outside, interrupted Miss Marple's reading. Hastily concealing the diary beneath a cushion, she took up her knitting needles and adopted an expression of drowsy inattention. The footsteps continued past her door, descending toward the main hall. Curiosity overcoming caution, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and followed at a discreet distance. The corridor was illuminated only by moonlight filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. As she reached the landing overlooking the entrance hall, she observed a slender figure standing before Lady Blackwood's portrait. It was Caroline, clad in a dark dressing gown, her grey-streaked hair hanging loose about her shoulders. In her hand was a long, thin object that caught the moonlight with a metallic gleam, a letter opener or perhaps a slender knife. As Miss Marple watched in silent alarm, Caroline raised the implement toward the painting. "Miss Blackwood," Miss Marple called softly, descending the final steps. "Is something amiss?" Caroline started violently, turning with the blade still clutched in her hand. "Miss Marple, you startled me terribly." She quickly lowered the implement, attempting to conceal it within the folds of her dressing gown. "I couldn't sleep and thought I might." "Well, the frame has been troubling me. A section of the gilding has come loose, and I merely intended to fix it before it deteriorated further." "How conscientious of you to attend to it at such an hour," Miss Marple observed mildly, noting the perspiration on Caroline's brow despite the chill in the hall, "though perhaps a matter best left to Mr. Fleming, given his expertise." "Yes, of course," Caroline agreed hastily. "A foolish notion. I shall mention it to him tomorrow." She glanced once more at the portrait, an unreadable expression crossing her features. "Mother looks so lifelike, doesn't she? As though she might step out of the frame at any moment. Sometimes I fancy I can feel her watching us, judging our actions since her passing." "Portraits often have that quality," Miss Marple agreed. "The best artists capture not merely a likeness, but something of the spirit." As they ascended the stairs together, Miss Marple could not help but notice how Caroline's gaze remained fixed on the portrait until it passed out of sight. Whatever secret Lady Blackwood had hidden behind her eyes, it seemed Miss Caroline Blackwood was equally determined to discover it. Dawn was breaking when Miss Marple was startled from a light sleep by the sound of urgent voices and hurried footsteps in the corridor. Donning her dressing gown, she opened her door to find the household in disarray. Servants rushed past with basins of water and towels, while Dr. Harley emerged from a room further along the corridor, his expression grave. "What has happened?" Miss Marple inquired of a passing maid. "It's Mr. Winters, miss," the girl replied, her eyes wide with shock. "The master's solicitor found dead in his bed, not half an hour ago. Dr. Harley says it was his heart." "But," Miss Marple prompted gently. The maid leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "There's scratches on his hands, miss, like he fought with someone, and cook swears she heard raised voices from his room well after midnight. Said it sounded like Mr. Winters and a woman, arguing fierce-like." As the maid hurried away, Miss Marple glanced down the corridor to where Harold Winters' room stood open, revealing glimpses of the scene within. Sir Richard's voice could be heard, demanding to know how such a thing could have happened to a man in perfect health. Dr. Harley's replies were too low to distinguish. Miss Marple retreated into her room, her mind racing. The diary hidden beneath her cushion suddenly seemed to carry a weight far greater. Whatever secret Lady Blackwood had concealed, it appeared that knowledge of it might now have claimed another life. Chapter 3. Family Secrets. By mid-morning, Blackwood Manor had been transformed into a scene of official inquiry. Inspector Green, a methodical man with greying temples and shrewd eyes, had arrived with 2 constables summoned by Dr. Harley at Sir Richard's reluctant insistence. The drawing-room had been commandeered for interviews, with household members called in one by one. Miss Marple observed the proceedings from her seat by the window, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she appeared to focus solely on her work. In reality, her attention was keenly fixed on the interactions unfolding before her. "Heart failure, you say, Dr. Harley?" Inspector Green's voice carried the faint accent of his Lancashire origins. At his age, and with no prior history of cardiac issues, Dr. Harley cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The symptoms are consistent with a sudden cardiac event, Inspector. Winters was under considerable strain, I understand, some complex legal matter involving the estate. And these abrasions on his fingers." The inspector consulted his notebook, quite unusual for a man who died in his sleep. Wouldn't you agree? "Perhaps he struck his hand against the nightstand during the episode," Dr. Harley suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "The body sometimes undergoes involuntary movements in such cases." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "If I might make an observation, Inspector," she interjected gently, "I couldn't help but notice traces of candle wax on the sleeve of Mr. Winter's dressing gown when I glimpsed him being removed from his room. Most curious, as the room is equipped with electric lighting." Inspector Green turned to her with renewed interest. "Indeed, Miss Marple, Jane Marple, a friend of Mrs. Vane's visiting from St. Mary Mead. And you're in the habit of noticing such details, Miss Marple. It's merely that it reminded me of my nephew Raymond's father-in-law, who insisted on reading by candlelight despite his wife's installation of the most modern electric lamps. He claimed it strained his eyes less, though the real reason, as his valet confided, was his habit of examining important documents late at night that he preferred others not to know about." She resumed her knitting with an apologetic smile. "But perhaps I'm being fanciful. The inspector's expression suggested he thought otherwise. Harley, I'd like a more thorough examination of the body before we determine cause of death, and I'll be speaking with everyone who was in the house last night." The interviews proceeded methodically. Sir Richard maintained a facade of irritated cooperation, insisting that Winters had been in perfect health and that his death, while regrettable, was clearly natural. Victoria, who had finally emerged from her chambers looking pale and drawn, claimed to have retired early with a migraine and heard nothing unusual. Percy Fleming, too, professed to have slept soundly after working late in his makeshift studio. When it was Caroline's turn, Miss Marple noted the woman's tightly clasped hands and the shadows beneath her eyes. "You were close to your mother, I understand, Miss Blackwood?" Inspector Green inquired after preliminary questions about her whereabouts the previous night. Caroline seemed startled by the change in topic. "Yes, quite close, but I fail to see what that has to do with Harold Winter's death." "Indulge me," the inspector replied. "I'm trying to establish a complete picture of the household dynamics. Mr. Winters had been your family solicitor for many years, handling your mother's affairs as well." "Yes, Harold. Mr. Winters managed my mother's estate after her death, transferring control to Richard as her primary heir." "And you had no reason to question this arrangement?" A flicker of something resentment, perhaps, crossed Caroline's features. "My mother's will was clear. The bulk of the estate passed to Richard as the male heir, according to family tradition. I received a generous annuity and the right to remain at Blackwood Manor for life." "I see." The inspector made a note. "And Mr. Winters never indicated any irregularities in these arrangements." Caroline's gaze sharpened. "What are you implying, Inspector?" "Nothing at all, Miss Blackwood. Routine inquiries only." After Caroline was dismissed, Miss Marple found herself summoned next. The inspector regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and professional assessment. "Mrs. Vane tells me you have some experience with investigative matters, Miss Marple." "Oh, nothing so formal as your own excellent work, Inspector," she demurred. "One simply observes similarities to past incidents. Human nature changes very little, even in circumstances as grand as Blackwood Manor? And have you observed any such similarities here that might illuminate Mr. Winter's death?" Miss Marple considered her words carefully. "I couldn't help recalling the case of old Mr. Septimus at Little Paddocks, found dead of apparent heart failure, but it transpired he had discovered his grandnephew tampering with the family trust. The young man had visited him the night before with a cup of cocoa, laced as it happened, with a heart stimulant that for a man of Mr. Septimus's age and condition proved fatal, but left few traces." The inspector leaned forward. "Are you suggesting Mr. Winters was poisoned, Miss Marple?" "Oh dear, no," she replied with a self-deprecating smile. "Merely that when a solicitor dies suddenly after examining family papers, one naturally wonders what he might have discovered. Mr. Winters seemed preoccupied yesterday, quite unlike his usual precise demeanor." When the interviews concluded, Inspector Green departed with assurances that his inquiries would continue. The household settled into an uneasy calm, disrupted only by the news that Mr. Winter's body would be taken to London for further examination, a development that visibly displeased Sir Richard. Miss Marple seized the opportunity to speak privately with Caroline, discovering her in the conservatory among her prized orchids. The air was heavy with humidity, creating a tropical atmosphere at odds with the grey English day visible through the glass panes. "They're quite exquisite," Miss Marple remarked, admiring a particularly delicate bloom. "Such patience required for their cultivation." "Mother began this collection," Caroline replied, misting the plants with methodical care. "I merely maintain her legacy." "Your mother seems to have been a remarkable woman," Miss Marple ventured. "Artistic, cultured, with a keen eye for beauty." "She was extraordinary," Caroline agreed, her voice softening. "This house was alive when she presided over it. After her death, everything changed. Richard married Victoria within 6 months. Indecently hasty, though few remarked upon it. The artistic salon Mother had cultivated disappeared. The music room was closed, her friends no longer welcome. A difficult adjustment for you, Miss Marple," observed sympathetically. Caroline's hands stilled. "Do you know, Miss Marple, my mother's illness was so sudden that even Dr. Harley was bewildered. She had been in perfect health, then complained of dizziness, vision disturbances, progressive weakness. Within a week, she was gone." She glanced toward the door, lowering her voice. "I've often wondered whether her death was entirely natural," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Richard inherited everything, the manor, the estate, the investment portfolio. He'd been increasingly resentful of Mother's control of the family finances, especially after she expressed disapproval of his relationship with Victoria. The timing was convenient." "Did Mr. Winters share your concerns?" Caroline's expression closed. Harold was bound by professional ethics. He executed the will as written. But lately, she hesitated. He'd been reviewing the estate papers with unusual thoroughness. Yesterday, he asked me about Mother's diary, whether I knew if she kept one in her final years. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. "And did she?" "Yes, though I never located it after her death. Mother was intensely private about her personal writings." Caroline's gaze was direct. "Miss Marple, I believe Harold discovered something in those old papers, something concerning my mother's death, or her final wishes, and now he too is dead." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The portrait that was so recently restored, might I ask when it was painted?" "In the months before her death. Mother had commissioned Percy's mentor, the artist Roland, was nearly complete when she died, but it disappeared from the artist's studio shortly afterward. Richard claimed it must have been stolen and showed little interest in recovering it. Yet young Mr. Fleming discovered it in the attics a decade later." "Yes, quite the coincidence, isn't it?" Caroline's tone suggested she found it anything but. "Percy claimed it had been stored away in a forgotten room, wrapped in protective canvas. The remarkable thing is how perfectly it captures Mother that penetrating gaze that always saw too much. As Miss Marple left the conservatory, she encountered Dr. Harley in the corridor, his expression troubled. "Ah, Miss Marple, I was hoping for a word in private." He glanced around nervously. "Perhaps we might take a turn in the garden. The rain has cleared temporarily. The gravel paths were still damp, and a light mist clung to the ornamental shrubs as they walked in silence until well away from the house. I fear I may have misled the inspector, Doctor," Harley confessed abruptly. "Mr. Winter's symptoms, they reminded me of another case. Lady Blackwood's final illness presented similarly sudden onset, rapid deterioration. At the time, I attributed it to a rare form of heart disease. But now you have doubts," Miss Marple prompted. "I preserved some samples of Lady Blackwood's blood, a professional habit when dealing with unusual cases. I never conducted the additional tests I'd intended. Sir Richard was eager to have the matter concluded. But recently, reviewing my notes, I've grown concerned that both Lady Blackwood and now Mr. Winters may have been poisoned with a substance that mimics natural heart failure. Have you shared these concerns with Inspector Green?" Dr. Harley looked away. "Not yet. I need to be certain. The implications, if Sir Richard," he straightened his shoulders. "I've sent the samples to a colleague in London for analysis until I have results. This conversation must remain between us." That evening, the household gathered for dinner in strained silence. The empty chair where Harold Winters would have sat loomed like an accusation. Sir Richard was particularly attentive to Victoria, who remained pale and withdrawn, startling at every unexpected sound. Percy Fleming attempted to lighten the mood with anecdotes from his travels, but his usual charm seemed forced. Miss Marple noticed how his gaze repeatedly drifted to the portrait in the hall, visible through the partially open dining room door. After dinner, Sir Richard announced he would be retiring to his study with urgent papers to review. As the company dispersed, Miss Marple observed him pausing before the portrait, studying it with an expression of mingled hatred and fear before hurrying away. The night drew in, wrapping Blackwood Manor in darkness, broken only by occasional flashes of distant lightning. A storm was approaching, its low thunder a counterpoint to the secrets gathering beneath the ancient roof. Chapter 4. The Second Death. The storm that had threatened throughout the evening finally broke over Blackwood Manor just before dawn, lashing the windows with rain and illuminating the dark corridors with flashes of lightning. Miss Marple had slept fitfully, her dreams troubled by images of watching eyes and whispered secrets. She was already awake, seated by her window with a shawl around her shoulders, when the scream echoed through the house. It was a horrible sound, not the startled cry of surprise, but the sustained wail of genuine horror. Miss Marple was on her feet instantly, reaching for her dressing gown as hurried footsteps and voices filled the corridor outside. She opened her door to find Eleanor rushing past, her face ashen. "What has happened?" Miss Marple inquired, though a chilling premonition had already formed in her mind. "Victoria!" Eleanor gasped, barely pausing. "The main staircase. Oh, it's dreadful." Following in Eleanor's wake, Miss Marple descended the corridor toward the grand staircase that dominated the entrance hall. A cluster of figures had already gathered at its base, Sir Richard on his knees beside a crumpled form, Caroline standing slightly apart with one hand pressed to her mouth, and Dr. Harley, his professional composure firmly in place as he examined the still figure on the marble floor. It was Victoria, dressed in a silk dressing gown of pale blue that spread around her like water. Her golden hair, freed from its usual careful arrangement, formed a halo around her face, which remained untouched and nearly peaceful. The rest of her body, however, lay at angles nature never intended. Her neck, visible beneath the cascade of hair, showed the unmistakable deformity of a clean break. "She must have fallen," Sir Richard was saying, his voice unnaturally high. "Slipped on the stairs in the darkness. The storm, perhaps she was frightened by the lightning." "Indeed, Doctor," Harley murmured, though his expression as he glanced up at the staircase suggested he found this explanation less than satisfactory. We should not move her until the authorities arrive. Authorities? Sir Richard's head snapped up. Surely that's unnecessary. A tragic accident, Sir Richard, Doctor. Harley interrupted with uncharacteristic firmness. Given Mr. Winter's recent death and the unusual circumstances, I must insist on following proper procedure. Miss Marple, approaching quietly, noted something the others had overlooked in their distress, a distinct bruise forming on Victoria's wrist, the unmistakable pattern of fingerprints, as though someone had grasped her arm with considerable force. How unfortunate that Inspector Green had only just returned to London, she remarked. Though I imagine he will be recalled promptly. Sir Richard rose unsteadily to his feet, his usually commanding presence diminished by shock. This is absurd. My wife had a habit of walking when she couldn't sleep. The storm, the darkened staircase, a tragic accident, nothing more. Of course, Dr. Harley soothed, though his eyes met Miss Marple's with shared skepticism. Nevertheless, procedure must be followed. The local police constable, summoned by a hastily dispatched footman, arrived within the hour, a young man clearly out of his depth, who seemed relieved when informed that Inspector Green would be returning from London. The body was left in situ, covered respectfully with a sheet, while the household retreated to the morning room to await developments. Percy Fleming was the last to join them, his artistic dishevelment more pronounced than usual. I was working in my studio, he explained, running a hand through his already tousled hair. The storm provides excellent dramatic lighting, and I often paint through the night when inspiration strikes. What's happened? The servants are whispering about another tragedy. Caroline informed him of Victoria's death in clipped, clinical terms. Miss Marple observed his reaction carefully, the momentary slackening of his features, the flash of what might have been genuine grief, quickly masked behind appropriate expressions of shock and condolence. How terrible for you, Sir Richard, he offered. Lady Blackwood was a vibrant presence in this sometimes sombre house. Sir Richard acknowledged this with a curt nod, his gaze fixed on the rain-lashed windows. My wife was afraid of storms, he said distantly. Since childhood, she must have been seeking company, or perhaps a sedative from the medicine cabinet in my dressing room. Were you not in your chamber, Sir Richard? Miss Marple inquired innocently. I was working late in my study, he replied, a defensive edge entering his voice. Victoria and I maintained separate bedrooms, a not uncommon arrangement in houses of this size. Inspector Green arrived shortly before noon, accompanied by a police surgeon and a dour-faced sergeant. After a preliminary examination of the body and the staircase, he proceeded to interview each member of the household individually, beginning with Sir Richard. While awaiting her turn, Miss Marple took the opportunity to visit Victoria's bedroom, ostensibly to help Eleanor collect appropriate garments for the poor woman's final arrangements. The room reflected Victoria's personality, elegant, modern furnishings in fashionable styles, with an abundance of silver-framed photographs and crystal perfume bottles arranged on the dressing table. Such a lovely room, Miss Marple commented, and so different in style from the rest of the house. Victoria insisted on redecorating when she married Sir Richard, Eleanor replied, selecting a gown from the wardrobe. Lady Blackwood's former rooms were too stuffy and antiquated for her taste. Caroline was quite upset. Her mother's apartments dismantled and remodeled within months of her death. The tensions between them must have been considerable. Victoria tried in her way, Eleanor said fairly. But she was young, fashionable, accustomed to her as an interloper who had enchanted Richard while their mother was barely cold in her grave. While Eleanor busied herself with the wardrobe, Miss Marple examined the dressing table with casual interest, noting the various cosmetics and jewelry cases. Her attention was caught by a small silver letter opener partially concealed beneath a handkerchief, an unusual item for a lady's dressing table. Beside it was a folded note, the edge just visible beneath a jewel box. Glancing to ensure Eleanor remained occupied, Miss Marple carefully extracted the note. The handwriting was bold and masculine. The message brief, "Fee meet me at midnight by the portrait. I've discovered what we've been seeking. We must act quickly before Ra suspects." "Destroy this." She had just replaced the note when Eleanor turned. "I think this gown would be most appropriate, don't you? Victoria wore it to last year's Christmas service." "A fine choice," Miss Marple agreed, her mind racing with the implications of the note she had discovered. Most dignified, when finally summoned for her interview with Inspector Green, Miss Marple found him established in the library, surrounded by notes and with a pot of strong tea at his elbow. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, "I understand from my colleagues in other districts that you have something of a reputation for insight in these matters." "People are kind enough to say so," she replied modestly, "though I'm merely an observer of human nature." "And what has your observation revealed about this household?" Miss Marple considered her words carefully. "Blackwood Manor harbors many secrets, Inspector. Lady Blackwood's death a decade ago cast a long shadow, and the recent discovery of her portrait seems to have disturbed carefully maintained equilibriums. Dr. Harley has shared his concerns about Lady Blackwood's death," the inspector revealed. "He's arranged for the analysis of preserved blood samples, most irregular medical practice, but potentially illuminating. And Victoria, Lady Blackwood, your preliminary findings? The police surgeon confirms a broken neck, consistent with a fall down the stairs," Green replied. "However, bruising patterns suggest she may have been assisted in that fall. There are finger marks on her right wrist and evidence of a struggle, defensive scratches on her left hand." "I observed the bruising," Miss Marple confirmed. "Most distinctive. Did you notice anything unusual last night, Miss Marple?" "Any movements or sounds? I was awake during much of the storm," she acknowledged. "Shortly after the largest thunderclap around 3 in the morning, I believe. I did hear footsteps in the corridor, light and hurried. I assumed it was someone disturbed by the tempest, male or female. Impossible to say with certainty. The carpeting muffles such distinctions." The inspector made a note. "We've discovered something else of interest. Lady Blackwood appeared to have been corresponding with someone in the house. Notes concealed in books in the library, arranged according to some private system. The most recent, found in a volume of Tennyson, suggests a midnight meeting. With Mr. Fleming, perhaps?" Miss Marple suggested innocently. Green's eyebrows rose. "You've observed something to that effect?" "Merely speculating based on their interactions. They seem to share a certain understanding." After completing her interview, Miss Marple sought out Percy Fleming, finding him in his makeshift studio in the old nursery. Several canvases in various stages of completion were arranged around the room, and the artist himself stood before an easel, aggressively applying paint to a landscape that seemed to mirror the turbulent weather outside. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged without turning, "come to see how the artistic temperament processes tragedy." "I was curious about your work," she replied mildly. "You have a distinctive style, bold, almost feverish brushstrokes. Self-taught? Largely, though I studied briefly with Roland Fleming, a distant relation and master of portrait work. He recognized my potential when others saw only childish dabbling. He painted the original portrait of Lady Blackwood. I understand?" Fleming's brush paused. "Yes, one of his last commissions before his death. A masterpiece of psychological insight. He captured Evelyn Blackwood's essence, that penetrating intelligence and hint of secrets kept." "You speak as though you knew her personally." "Only through Roland's descriptions," he replied smoothly, resuming his painting. He spoke of her often during our lessons, her appreciation for art, her cultural refinement, so at odds with her son's Philistine tendencies. Yet you recognized the portrait immediately when you discovered it in the attics." "Roland had sketches, preliminary studies. I knew her face." He turned to face Miss Marple directly. "Why this interest in a decade-old portrait, Miss Marple? Surely Victoria's death demands more immediate attention." Perhaps they're connected, she suggested. Secrets have a way of resurfacing, Mr. Fleming, especially when concealed behind watchful eyes. A flicker of something, alarm, calculation, crossed his features before he mastered it. Poetic, but hardly practical. If you'll excuse me, I find work therapeutic in times of distress. That evening, with Inspector Green having established temporary headquarters in the village police station, the residents of Blackwood Manor gathered for a subdued dinner. Sir Richard, though clearly distressed, insisted on maintaining normal routines for the sake of decorum. The conversation was stilted, focused mainly on arrangements for Victoria's funeral and speculation about when the police would permit the removal of her body from the entrance hall, where it remained under guard. After dinner, Miss Marple observed Sir Richard making his way furtively toward the portrait in the hall. Concealing herself behind a heavy curtain, she watched as he examined the frame carefully, his fingers probing along its edge as if seeking a hidden catch or compartment. His concentration was so complete that he failed to notice approaching footsteps until Caroline appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing, Richard?" she demanded. He started guiltily. "The frame seems loose." "I was checking if it needed repair. At this hour, with Victoria lying dead, not 20 feet away?" Caroline's voice was cold with suspicion. "What are you really looking for?" "Nothing that concerns you," he snapped. "This is still my house, Caroline, despite your apparent alliance with the police. Your eagerness to suggest foul play is noted and will be remembered." "I seek only truth," she replied, as did Harold Winters before his convenient heart attack, as Victoria perhaps discovered to her cost. Sir Richard advanced on his sister, his expression darkening. "Be very careful, Caroline. Accusations without proof can be dangerous, especially when one has access to the same medicine cabinet from which our mother's pills went missing a decade ago." As Caroline gasped at this insinuation, Sir Richard brushed past her and strode away. Miss Marple remained motionless until Caroline too had departed, her shoulders rigid with indignation or fear. When the house had fallen silent, Miss Marple emerged from her hiding place and approached the portrait that had become the focal point of so much covert attention. Lady Blackwood's painted eyes seemed to follow her, that knowing expression holding the promise of revelations yet to come. "What secret do you hide behind those eyes?" Miss Marple murmured, studying the canvas in the dim light. The frame was indeed loose in one corner, the gilded moulding slightly separated from the wooden stretcher beneath. Careful probing with her fingertips revealed a small space behind the canvas, and within it the edge of what felt like paper. With delicate precision, Miss Marple extracted a folded document and what appeared to be a letter, both yellowed with age. The letter bore Lady Blackwood's elegant handwriting, addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." The document, bearing official seals and signatures, was immediately recognizable as a last will and testament, dated just 1 week before Lady Blackwood's death, and markedly different from the one that had been executed. "So that's what Harold Winters discovered," she whispered, the truth hidden behind her eyes just as the diary suggested. A floorboard creaked behind her. Miss Marple turned slowly, the papers clutched in her hand, to find herself facing the barrel of a small pistol held in a steady grip. "I believe those documents belong to me, Miss Marple," said a quiet voice. "Please hand them over." Chapter 5. Revelations. "Harley," Miss Marple acknowledged calmly, though her heart fluttered rapidly against her ribs. "I wouldn't have taken you for a man who resorts to firearms. The doctor's normally genial nation. These are extraordinary circumstances, Miss Marple. The documents, if you please." With deliberate slowness, she extended her hand, the papers rustling faintly in the midnight silence of the hall. "You've known all along, haven't you, about Lady Blackwood's true will?" "Not until recently," he admitted, taking the papers with his free hand while keeping the pistol trained on her. "I had suspicions about her death, medical incongruities that troubled me, but no proof of wrongdoing. Then Harold Winters approached me last week, hinting at irregularities he'd discovered in the estate papers. And now you hold the evidence that Sir Richard disinherited his sister through forgery and perhaps murder, Miss Marple observed. A dangerous position, Doctor. Indeed. He glanced down at the documents, which is why I must ask for your discretion until morning. I've arranged for Inspector Green to return at first light with the results of Lady Blackwood's blood analysis. When he arrives, I shall present this evidence as well. Miss Marple studied him carefully. You're not the villain in this piece, then? A weary smile crossed his face as he lowered the pistol, merely a coward who waited too long to speak the truth. I should have questioned Lady Blackwood's death more rigorously 10 years ago, but Sir Richard was persuasive, and the family's influence considerable. I convinced myself my doubts were unfounded, until Harold Winters died in similar circumstances. Precisely. He folded the documents carefully. The similarities were too pronounced to ignore. I retrieved the preserved blood samples from my office safe and sent them for modern toxicological analysis. The results arrived this afternoon, clear evidence of poisoning with a rare plant derivative that induces symptoms nearly indistinguishable from heart failure. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the quarter hour, its resonant tones echoing through the silent house. Dr. Harley glanced nervously toward the darkened corridors. We should not remain here, he whispered. Return to your room, Miss Marple. Lock your door until morning. Trust no one. As they parted at the foot of the stairs, Miss Marple paused. Be careful, Doctor. Whoever killed Harold Winters and Victoria will not hesitate to silence another threat. His answering smile held fatalistic understanding. I've lived too long with my complicity, Miss Marple. One must eventually face the consequences of one's choices. Sleep proved elusive as Miss Marple contemplated the revelations of the night. Lady Blackwood had been murdered, her true will concealed, and her fortune diverted from Caroline to Sir Richard. Harold Winters had discovered the deception and paid with his life. Victoria, too, had learned something dangerous, perhaps through her association with Percy Fleming, whose connection to the family remained unclear. Dawn was breaking when a commotion below drew Miss Marple from her room. Voices raised in alarm guided her to Dr. Harley's chamber, where she found a cluster of servants and a pale-faced Eleanor outside the door. He won't answer, Eleanor explained, wringing her hands. He's always been an early riser, the first to breakfast, but his door is locked, and there's no response to our knocking. Sir Richard appeared, hastily dressed, his expression thunderous. What's this disturbance? It's Dr. Harley, sir, the butler explained. We fear something may have happened to him. Nonsense. He's probably sleeping soundly for once. Nevertheless, Sir Richard pounded on the door. When no answer came, he stepped back. Break it down. The door yielded after several forceful blows. Within they found Dr. Harley seated at his desk, slumped forward as though he had fallen asleep while working. A half-empty glass of brandy stood at his elbow, alongside an open journal and scattered papers. Another heart attack, Sir Richard suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Miss Marple approached the desk, noting the absence of the documents she had discovered behind the portrait. In their place was a handwritten statement in Dr. Harley's distinctive script, dated with yesterday's date. It appears to be a confession of sorts, she observed, scanning the contents. Dr. Harley claims to have verified that Lady Blackwood was poisoned 10 years ago and believes the same method was used against Harold Winters. Preposterous, Sir Richard blustered, though a vein pulsed visibly at his temple. Harley was becoming senile, imagining conspiracies. Fleming's composure cracked, his artistic facade giving way to raw emotion. She was going to acknowledge me, he said, his voice barely audible. After a lifetime of secret meetings and correspondence through her artistic circles, she had decided to amend her will to include me in her legacy. And then she was murdered, poisoned by her own son, my half-brother, who never suspected my existence. So you orchestrated your entrance into Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple concluded. not merely to restore your mother's portrait, but to investigate her death and perhaps claim what you believed should rightfully be yours. I needed proof, Fleming admitted. The portrait was my creation, a copy of Rowland's original work, which I had studied extensively during my apprenticeship with him. I painted it specifically to gain entrance to Blackwood Manor, hiding my mother's letter and true will behind the canvas, where only someone who knew to look would find them. Inspector Green stepped forward. Mr. Fleming, I believe you have information vital to our investigation. Would you accompany us to the station? As Fleming was led away, Caroline remained motionless, her expression a complex mixture of shock, grief, and dawning comprehension. A brother, she murmured, mother's secret child. All these years, Miss Marple approached her gently. The truth often emerges in unexpected ways, Miss Blackwood. Your mother sought to right an old wrong, though fate intervened before she could do so openly. Outside, the rain had finally ceased, weak sunlight breaking through clouds that had shrouded Blackwood Manor for days. Like the weather, the atmosphere within the ancient house had shifted, darkness receding, though the shadows of past deeds would linger long in its corridors and in the memory of those who had witnessed the portrait's final revelation. Chapter 6. The Portrait of Truth. The great hall of Blackwood Manor was illuminated by afternoon sunlight streaming through the high windows, casting the portrait of Lady Blackwood in a revealing clarity that seemed appropriate for the occasion. At Miss Marple's request, Inspector Green had gathered all the remaining inhabitants at the house before the painting that had been the silent witness to so much deception and tragedy. I have asked you here, Miss Marple began, her unassuming figure belying the authority in her voice, because it is time for the full truth to emerge from behind the shadows that have clouded this house for a decade. Sir Richard stood to one side, his imperious bearing diminished by the events of the past days, but his expression still defiant. He had been released from custody, pending further investigation, though the constable positioned discreetly by the door made clear his freedom was provisional at best. Despite appearances, Miss Marple continued, Sir Richard is not responsible for the recent deaths at Blackwood Manor, though evidence suggests his complicity in his mother's demise 10 years ago. You have no proof of that, Sir Richard interjected, but his protest lacked conviction. On the contrary, Inspector Green countered, Dr. Harley's toxicology reports provide compelling evidence. But please continue, Miss Marple. The true architect of the recent tragedies, she said, turning to face the assembled company, is Mr. Percy Fleming. Caroline gasped. My brother? But why would he— Half-brother, Miss Marple corrected gently. And his motives were complex, a blend of revenge for your mother's death and reclamation of what he viewed as his rightful inheritance. Miss Marple moved toward the portrait, standing beneath Lady Blackwood's painted gaze. Fleming discovered his true parentage as a young man and cultivated his artistic talents to gain entrance to the circles Lady Blackwood frequented. When she died suddenly, he suspected foul play, but lacked means to investigate. For years he planned his entry into Blackwood Manor, eventually fabricating the discovery of his mother's portrait, a painting he himself had created based on studies of Rowland Fleming's work. A forgery, Eleanor whispered, staring at the portrait with new understanding. An homage, Miss Marple corrected, painted with genuine filial devotion, but also with calculated purpose. Behind the canvas, he concealed Lady Blackwood's true will, and a letter explaining his identity. Documents he intended to discover at the opportune moment. Inspector Green took up the narrative. Mr. Fleming has confessed that his original plan was simply to expose Sir Richard's crime and claim his inheritance. But when he arrived at Blackwood Manor, he discovered that Harold Winters had independently begun investigating discrepancies in the estate documents. Winters approached Fleming, Miss Marple explained, recognizing his resemblance to Lady Blackwood and suspecting his true identity. But rather than an ally, Winters found himself a threat to Fleming's carefully orchestrated plan. So Fleming poisoned him, Caroline concluded, her voice hollow with disbelief. Using knowledge gleaned from his mother's diaries about the rare toxin that had killed her, Miss Marple confirmed he administered it in a late-night brandy, creating the appearance of a heart attack while he searched Winter's room for any evidence the solicitor had accumulated. And Victoria, Sir Richard demanded, genuine grief momentarily overcoming his self-interest. What threat could she possibly have posed? She discovered Mr. Fleming's true identity, Miss Marple explained, not through investigation but through intimacy. Their clandestine relationship provided opportunity for unguarded moments. When she realized who he was and, more damning, what he had done to Harold Winters, she attempted to use this knowledge to secure her own position. Blackmail, Inspector Green stated flatly. She arranged to meet him by the portrait that night. Miss Marple continued, "We found her note in his studio, but rather than yield to her demands, he silenced her, pushing her down the staircase when their confrontation grew heated." "Dr. Harley?" Eleanor asked. "Surely he posed no threat to Fleming." "The greatest threat of all," Miss Marple replied. Dr. Harley had finally connected all the pieces. The toxicology results from Lady Blackwood's preserved blood, the similar symptoms in Harold Winters' death, and most damning, the will and letter I discovered behind the portrait, which I shared with him that very night. "Fleming must have observed your meeting," Inspector Green surmised. "Indeed, after I retired, he confronted the doctor, demanded the documents, and administered the same poison that had claimed Lady Blackwood and Harold Winters, staging it to appear as suicide." Caroline sank into a chair, her face ashen. "My own brother, half-brother, a murderer 3 times over, driven by a twisted sense of justice," Miss Marple observed. "In his mind, he was merely claiming what should have been his and punishing those who stood in his way." She turned to Sir Richard. "Including you, whom he blamed for your mother's death." "I never poisoned my mother," Sir Richard protested, though his eyes slid away from the portrait's unflinching gaze. "Perhaps not by your own hand," Miss Marple allowed. "But Mr. Fleming discovered evidence in your mother's diaries suggesting you were aware of and benefited from the deed, a suspicion now being thoroughly investigated by Inspector Green's team." The grandfather clock tolled the hour, its sonorous chimes echoing through the hall like a final judgment. Inspector Green stepped forward. "Sir Richard Blackwood, in light of new evidence and Percy Fleming's testimony, I am arresting you as an accessory to the murder of Lady Evelyn Blackwood." As Sir Richard was led away, his decades of privilege and position crumbling around him, Caroline approached the portrait of her mother, studying the painted features with new awareness. "All these years," she murmured, "and I never saw the resemblance. How blind we can be to what stands before us." "We see what we expect to see," Miss Marple replied gently, "and truth often hides in plain sight, much like the secret behind your mother's eyes." 1 week later, as Miss Marple prepared to depart Blackwood Manor, Caroline presented her with a small package. "A token of gratitude," she explained, "for bringing light to our family's darkness." Within the wrapping, Miss Marple found a miniature portrait. Lady Blackwood in her youth, her eyes bright with intelligence and promise. "I shall treasure it," Miss Marple assured her, a reminder that even the most carefully concealed truths will eventually find their way into the light. As her train pulled away from the station, Miss Marple gazed back at the distant silhouette of Blackwood Manor against the autumn sky. The house would begin anew under Caroline's stewardship, its shadows gradually receding as the portrait of Lady Blackwood continued its silent vigil, no longer harboring secrets, but standing as testament to the enduring power of truth.